Hello friends. I hope that this is finding you well. I got a question from the previous video series, which was a very good question, asking about how the faction missions are possibly going to impact an individual's choices as far as career path and things like that in the coming future. Particularly, this is a poignant question right now because there's so much unknown and uncertainty surrounding what work is going to look like, and it's really being called into question. So I think this is a really poignant discussion, not regardless of how you feel about the rest of it or how, the previous video series resonated with you. I wanted to offer a follow-up and some more clarification to crystallize these ideas about what a human life cycle is going to start to look like in the not so distant future, and how I think it's one of the most important questions to be asking right now, besides, sort of those macroeconomic questions. I think looking at the implications for the individual and how we haven't really kept up with the radical advancements in technology and social evolution, our ideas about what you should have achieved at a certain age or what your life should be shaping up like, those things are still very rooted in lifestyles that we don't presently live. So I think that's kind of the number one thing that's causing a lot of discord right now, both intergenerationally and misunderstandings between, kind of the older generation and their set of expectations versus the reality that millennials and younger are being faced with and having to try to navigate with this outdated set of benchmarks through their life cycle. So I think this is one of the most important discussions that we can be having right now as far as social design. So I wanted to chat with you in this slightly more informal, just me reporting my ideas, no script or anything, to you as a follow-up to the previous series. So we talked a bit in the series covering reform of education. That was kind of more geared towards higher education a little bit. So now we're going to take it all the way back, start from the beginning, and because I have neglected to do so thus far, and I apologize for that. We're getting to it now. So I really want to look critically at these intervals of life, and we touched on them in the Language of Astrology series, but you don't necessarily have to have watched those to, get value out of this video, though I do, of course, recommend you do go back and watch those if you're interested. But looking at life kind of in these 7-year brackets, integrating some more of the Eastern thought with the more widely known conventional Western astrological system. I wanted to kind of interject here because I realized I don't think I've even mentioned it yet. One of my favorite concepts in the whole of the conflicts is kind of a play on words I've snuck in there a little bit. Jubilee. Jubilee is the word for the LARP intervals that we're going to be having. But that word also stems from an ancient Jewish tradition, which is on this 7-year cycle, and I think it's really important to talk about here. Every 7 years, it was customary for all contracts to be null, all debts to be forgiven, all slaves to be freed. So, the maximum term that you would be serving is 7 years, depending on where you fell in on that. And maybe most importantly of all fields would be allowed to fallow for a year. I could be wrong about the exact duration, please don't quote me on that part. The main thing is just this notion of rest, forgiveness, impermanence, the idea that these things can't go on forever. This debt can't be prolonged. There would still be accountability, but after a certain amount of time, the contracts would be nullified to make room for new growth, to make room for new things to come in and happen. So that connotation might not be well represented in the LARP, because of course that's a very active thing. It's very like we're getting together to do this thing in celebration and so forth. So the idea of rest probably won't carry over into that quite right, but I like the word. I wanted to include it in that way and use it that way, but that's what it means. So this is really important because there's other correlations that this 7-year cycle, we have these brackets in our life that are kind of skewed and neglected with our current thinking about what should be happening at particular ages. So I think that a return to really observing that would be beneficial. And I'll talk about my view on what each of those brackets should be. But it's worth noting that it's talked about a lot by astrologers, and if you watch any tarot readers or anything like that, they'll be talking about it a lot right now. A lot of people in the millennial generation are having to grapple with the concept of a Saturn return, and that in particular is important because usually that takes place anywhere between 27 to 30 or so years of age. So that will be hitting millennials particularly hard because a lot of them are not only going through that, which is a significant benchmark for any human being to be going through in an important age for reevaluation, but given current events, it might be hitting a little bit harder right now because things are already quite difficult, and the emotional impact of having to do things like rediscover the inner child, heal trauma, maybe even completely reinvent yourself or who you think you are. That's a lot to be putting on your plate on top of everything else. So that benchmark in particular will need to be significantly reevaluated in the future and some of that pressure alleviated, because I think hyper pressurizing some of these intervals can really be stunting for personal growth, So let's start off the top, though. So that's just a preview. We'll talk about that in greater detail. But the general arc of how a person's life will progress in the future, in my thinking, goes a little bit more like this. So in studying early childhood developmental psychology, as I've touched on, obviously I'm by no means fluent or qualified, but it is of interest to me, and I've tried to put in some work understanding that whole thing. And my understanding is that the most important thing to do is to get your child to an optimal state of being a desirable playmate, being able to play and communicate with other children, because if they're not able to do this, they're not going to be able to learn. The most important way that children communicate and learn is through play. So the biggest task of a parent in those really early formative years is just to make sure that they're a suitable playmate. And we have sort of messed with this too much, I think, to our downfall in our modern society, because there's a lot of effort to interject very kind of technical, standardized test sort of oriented STEM things at too early of an age. And while maybe there is some validity to the idea and the science that because there's so much plasticity and because children absorb things like a sponge, maybe you could get some sort of jumpstart or edge by introducing those concepts really early. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's putting too much focus on the wrong thing when really what's going to serve them for the whole of their life is getting properly socialized and, getting in touch with their motor skills, getting in touch with their body and their limits and their emotions, and all of these things are just infinitely more important than, being able to read by kindergarten, Well, that's all well and good. And if it's the child's genuine interest, by all means, cultivate that. But I think parents are under kind of a superficial pressure to enrich their children and be this sort of helicopter, and expose them to all these things and make sure, they're super smart and all this. But really, kindness, compassion, healthy emotional regulation, it's so much more important. So the first bracket, from 1 to 7, especially I believe it's 4, making sure that they engage in enough what's called rough and tumble play, their physicality, learn what like healthy touch is, learn how to communicate discomfort, learn how to receive communications of discomfort and cease and desist. That's all really important. 1 to 7. That's all you need to do. Anything above and beyond that is kind of not important, really. So that's the first bracket. And then from primary school years, right, from 7 to 14, I envision in the future that we're going to do away with the standardized testing, no child left behind, whatever, completely. I think that's going to be a total thing of the past. I think there will still be need for solid academic, science, math, reading stuff just for basic literacy. But I think even those years are going to be much more oriented towards socialization than our current paradigm sort of pushes. And I think that is coupled with this expectation that kids will get it from extracurricular activities. And while that can be true in a lot of cases, it's not a given thing. And I don't see any reason why it would not be more built in and more the norm. Because I think omitting certain things, be it like gym or music or those things that are more general, art, of course. I think splitting those off really early and being like, oh, these are fringe interests, only the kids that are really into that, go that way. Splitting those off from the core social studies, language arts kind of stuff, which everybody has to take and everybody's in together all the time. I think we've seen in a lot of educational, particularly a good thing to look into just because it's interesting is Waldorf education, which was championed by Rudolf Steiner, which is a much more holistic developmental ideology for young children that emphasizes like physical awareness and the social skills, getting a well-rounded education, having exposure to art, being able to really express yourself in a healthy way. That's much more of the emphasis than the current STEM, test score oriented early education. So I think that will kind of be the core for all children in the future, is something much more akin to like Waldorf, or more akin to something like the Japanese system where there's, the one homeroom, rather than how we have in most of America where it's just this compartmentalized, rotating, you pick your classes, you go to those classes. I think the bonds are not maybe as tight when you do it that way. And I realize it's probably structured that way to be an easier transition and a funnel into higher education, but I don't think it's particularly effective. So that's my vision. I'm not qualified as a young child educator at all, but from what I've learned, I think that's going to be more the way of it. So then the big split off, and I talk about this in my novel, and this is going to, I think, be the more controversial bit. The big split off happens at age 13 or 14 as this coming of age. Lots of cultures still sort of have that bar mitzvah, even quinceanera to some extent, that sort of you're considered to be pretty well formed at this age. And of course it's a very foreign concept to us in our modern, 18 is adulthood. I think it has to do with the treatment. Obviously, legally it would not be considered an adult, and that's not what I'm trying to say at all. I'm saying to be considered with a level of seriousness at that age, I think would be good. And considered with a level of seriousness is a lot different than being pinned down and confronted and forced to think about, oh, what are you going to be when you grow up? What do you want to do? Have all your stuff figured out by 14. That's ridiculous. And we already do that now. So, as weird as some of this stuff might sound, it really needs to be taken in context for the way that we currently do it, which is completely unacceptable. We can see in the rates of anxiety, depression, psychosis, we can see a shift, particularly when we started to organize ourselves in this way, in this very performance-driven over very limited set of parameters. It's not really pushing you to be excellent, pushing you to be your best. It's pushing a very few subjects, and your performance in those is this reflection of who you are in total, and you're given no freedom to explore your real passions, your real interests, and no support whatsoever for doing that. And I think it's wrong. So this is how we fix it. At age 14, I proposed that all children would go to essentially boarding school. And in the novel, everyone is sent to their faction's capital, to a city that is dedicated towards cultivating the core essence of that faction's values, their activities, their mission, and all of the inhabitants are of one faction, right? In the future, in my vision, all children will pretty much be reared in completely mixed cities. There's no factional division whatsoever in most of the settlements, but there are these special settlements wherever they end up being in the world that are dedicated to one faction in particular. And the idea is that that's the time that the young adult is becoming slightly more specialized, still very much pursuing a generalized education, but with slightly less emphasis on the hardcore socialization that is emphasized earlier in life. Starting to develop as an individual their particular interests, and trying to gain not just very entry-level competence, but taking a crack at a few things and trying to achieve maybe a higher level of competence, considering, pursuing that as a potential mastery when then they go on to higher education. So that's sort of more what should be explored and focused on during what would be this sort of middle school into high school age, that takes place from 14 to about 19 or so, depending on which birthday it lands on. And the idea is that the structure is really what's needed at that age, and so being removed from the support system of family is both traumatic, but I think really liberating and necessary. And anybody who's involved in things like summer camps and things like that knows well, like, you have to kind of be taken out of your comfort zone in order to develop more your individual self. So while it's a lot of pressure, and we haven't really tested this on a large scale, I think it would definitely be worth putting in the structure to do it that way, I think, for society at large as well. Because when I talked to my parents about this, of course, they kind of had this wistful fantasy, like, oh God, what if we did just ship all the teenagers off to boarding school? How awesome would it be to have them out of our hair for that entire interval? That's not the whole reason, but it's not a bad reason. It would be kind of, I think, helpful for having a specific outlet to channel the intensity. And the activities that are going to be engaged in are both like the introduction of the factionally specific activities to see if, see what sticks, basically, to see if that's something that the young adult is truly interested in pursuing, or if they prefer the more general things, or have completely different. You don't really know until you try it with a level of seriousness. So the capital city provides sort of this more insulated, specific set of parameters, removes some of the other variables right and gets it in kind of this more controlled state. And because there's this more controlled state, it can be much more intense and maybe extreme would be a word. The kind of like physical training that goes on during that time, I think it's very important for you to be not just physically active, but maybe even like training pretty specifically during that time. That was really beneficial for me. I've heard from tons of other people, that was kind of their escape, if you're having trouble in high school. You lift weights, that's one way to do it, or whatever sport or whatever discipline. So that's kind of where that starts to really take shape and happen, and each faction maybe has a little bit different flavor, different activities that they particularly like. In my example for Capricorn faction, the physical activities are more towards the weightlifting, strength training, but also yoga, and just like that grounded stability, rock climbing, hiking, earthy kind of things. That's sort of the flavor. So that's more of what that faction-specific society is engaged in, what the young adults are invited into. They're not treated differently necessarily based on their age. It's sort of like they get to enter and be integrated and for the first time be taken kind of seriously as adults within this very limited parameter. So the other thing that's going on, and this will be maybe controversial as well, I'm sure, the physical training also carries with it this ultimate goal of preparedness and martial capability and readiness to participate in the LARP later down the line in the Jubilee. And this activity acts as a type of coming of age. And the goal is for the young adults to be ready to participate on the far end, because in the future the resource-based economy, circulation of resources, is determined in this egalitarian way by outcomes of the various things that we've talked about, but also of the Jubilee matches. So instead of automatically franchising people to vote in this democratic way at age 18, it's more that you're actively voting with your participation in this distribution of resources. So you're not leaving it up to chance, how the resources are going to be used. You get a complete say, right, in what the priorities are. Because you've had, instead of taking something like civics, where you are learning the laws and the system of whatever government of whatever country you're in, instead of civics, you're learning the culture of the faction, the mission, the priorities, and the different avenues for participating in that. So instead of this test-driven, performance-driven, get into a good school with your scores, instead of, we throw that out. That's not happening in the future, right? Instead of that, during this middle high school time, it's like trade school. You get to go and study very specifically. In the novel, it's drafting, it's computing, it's kind of technical type of things, as well as sculpture, dexterity. Like we talked about in the skill matrix, different factions are going to kind of have certain areas of that are more their thing. So the young adult is going to be getting acclimated to that and really get an up close, intimate understanding with all of these other distractions removed of what that means, what the implications might be for them during the period of their life when they are most in tune with their individual value formation, right? You don't want to put that off till their mid-20s, which is what we currently do, right? We kind of press people to find themselves and then try to find themselves a place in society. And I think that's really backwards. I think what would be much more effective is if simultaneously, as you are growing into your own, you have all of the options sort of laid out and explained to you and demonstrated to you. And I think it's really important for people that age to be living among adults, kind of being treated as a young person. And especially with like people who are not just their family or their immediate family, their parents. Because everybody that I've ever talked to about this, when you are that age, the people that you really latch onto are more like a teacher in particular that made you fall in love with a subject, or somebody that you look up to in the community, somebody you volunteer with, right? There's all of these other orbital significant adults, or at least in ideal situation there should be. Maybe it's like slightly more removed family, maybe it's like uncles or something like that, that serve as role models and help to not have that immediacy of a parent. You can really want your parents' approval, so they're not a very good adult example when you're at that age, I think. You kind of want something that's a little bit farther removed, so you remove that that anxiety, or like that pressure to perform, or like that additional scrutiny. It gives you more freedom to experiment and go out of your immediate comfort zone and explore avenues that you wouldn't otherwise. And I think that separation from the parents at that age, one, it gives space for you to come back later in life and have a truly healthy relationship with them, because our society really pressurizes in a really artificial way, I think, like that parents are sort of this otherworldly being almost. They're not people, right? And when you're a teenager, you don't have necessarily the ability to view your parents as a human being with thoughts and feelings and ideas. They're an authoritarian figure who is always trying to tell you what to do. That's their whole bag. So if you remove sort of that layer when emotions are at their peak, when hormones are at their peak, whatever. It's a really throwaway way to think of it, but there is some biological legitimacy, but I think, in my opinion, it's the psychological, there are definitely hormonal things going on, but I think it's the pressure of what you're being tasked with at the time, and that creates a feedback loop with the parent, I think, because there's so much pressure on you as a parent from society to raise them well, and there's kind of the Stockholm syndrome, prisoner kind of dilemma. The parent has been artificially put in this position of authority, and that's really coming to light at that age, and they kind of can't help but feel the need to make interventions to do a good job. When up to that point, a lot of a parent's job, if it's going well, if everything is healthy and cool, a lot of the parent's job is actually to just watch, just to be present, to be there, to intervene if anything suboptimal happens, right? Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, about how the role of a father is to be very actively involved until age 4, like we just said. But then after that stage, what the father really needs to do, instead of stepping in all the time and intervening and acting as a judge and communicating disapproval and censoring and all these things, right? None of that. What really a father should be doing is just being present, sitting on the sidelines so that the child sees that vicinity, and knows that if anything really happened, if somebody came over and punched them, like, there would be repercussions, right? That's the father is a judge, but you don't want to be judging them individually in a way that stifles their development. You want to just be present and available and, watchful and interested and involved, but not you know, stopping them. So I think removing the child from home, putting them in a boarding school situation at that age, that formative age, helps both parties because it removes the pressure and the temptation for the parents to do that, right? It keeps them at a healthy distance. And they would still have communications, of course, they would still be, talking and reporting, but they wouldn't be immediately responsible for, bringing them up at that age. That then is the responsibility of the faction to teach them how to be that sign. And I think it's really appropriate to do at that age. And I think that there would be great psychological benefits to both parties, because then when the parent and the child are reunited on the far end and get to sort of have this adult relationship as two human beings, and that, of course, the entire thing is completely facilitated by the fact that we don't use capitalistic money system anymore. If we implemented these social systems where you have mobility, you have freedom to move anywhere that you want, live where you want, how you want. So there's no pressure for the parent to be providing in a fiscal way, right? Everybody's needs are all met all the time. So you don't need your parent to support you in a monetary way. So you remove a lot of the hang-ups as far as having to assign an allowance and having to set limits on all of these material things. And, those are very recent developments in our interactions, that it really hasn't been that way all the time. And in previous generations, it was much more the case that kids would leave home very, very early. There was no, it's not quite like it is today, where it's very common for people to be living with their parents at age 30 or so, at the time of their Saturn return, right? That's a no-no. You really don't want that, because that causes all kinds of stress and confusion. So, it's very recent that this has kind of become the norm for exclusively economic reasons. I don't think that there's anybody, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't really think that there's anyone who's willfully choosing to do that just because it's a good setup, unless maybe you're taking care of your parents who are older or sick or something like that. But I think overwhelmingly, at least in this country, there is this economic imperative that's forcing people into cohabitation that they might not otherwise necessarily want. And so if we get to a point where we can be free of all of that, I think that the relationships between children and parents are going to be radically different. And I think that going through these stages differently is going to help facilitate that. So if you do reduce, the period in which a parent is responsible for their child, right? If you reduce the overall amount of time and increase the intensity of the contact, I think that's beneficial for both parties. We sort of have this low quality, low grade contact by, parents in our current system don't really necessarily see their children a whole lot or spend a lot of quality time, be it because of needing to work all the time, lack of childcare, our general busyness, trying to schedule the child for all of these extra activities, which I think should probably just be built into school itself, and it shouldn't be the parents' job to ferry them around to and facilitate. I don't know. I feel like if you had just a solid span of time where it was like, okay, we're going to do the parent thing now, this is all we're doing, the focus is there, I think you would get a lot more enjoyment out of it. And I think that it might be kind of nice to cut out the parts that are kind of universally known to be a little bit more volatile. And then by the time you do reunite, you can just have this beautiful, loving, unconditional relationship, because you are not hung up on the economics or the being the provider, being responsible. At that point, they are just a person that has grown into their own, and then the parent gets to participate in their life in this totally different way, with this much more fully formed individual, compared to where they left off. I don't know. I think it would be quite cool. So that's that period. And then after this coming of age activity at age 18, 19, whatever that ends up being, there's a transitional period to maybe move around, try out different locations, see where the individual really wants to be. It's the optimal time for travel, seeing the world, getting to know different places, different cultures, things like that. So kind of course these are supposed to be 7-year brackets, so kind of that, what we would think of as taking a year off, right after you get out of high school. That whole period would actually be, until about age 21, would be seeing the world, figuring out your bearings, and kind of applying your factional values and your individual interests then on this sort of global level, and trying to get a feel for where you are in the world and where you want to take your first big leap, where you want to put your first roots down a little bit, but without the pressure of home ownership and all of these things in the future. When you have this heightened mobility, when housing is provided, and there's lots of different modes of that you can just choose from based on what's the best fit for your lifestyle, rather than having each one have a particular hierarchical connotation or value, or all of the judgment that follows from picking one over the other, or differences, of course, in price. If all of that was gone and people could just choose, do I want to live in an apartment? Do I want to live, on a farm? Do I want to live in a single family home? Do I want to cohabitate with friends? Do I want to start a family? Like, those are all on equal footing at that stage. You can choose the direction that's right for you. So you have much greater freedom than we currently have. And then during that period, before the Saturn return, right, from about 21 to 28 is what would be considered like the apprenticeship stage. So you got access during your stay in the capital to all of the trade school kind of level. If you really want to get obsessively involved in something, you have the freedom to do that at that age and get a lot of really quality hands-on attention from masters, from the people who in the future will end up being the mentors and the people who live in the capital, exclusively with members of their own faction. And of course, you don't have to do this your whole life long. You have that mobility. You could move. You could do this for a time. But the people who are going to be the ones who choose to be the educators in the capital really want to. Like, it's not something you just do. These are the people who are the most invested, the most passionate, who want to impart the values of the faction badly. So, you're not kind of getting these community college teacher types who are just like, couldn't get a job in the field, so I'm going to go. Not to knock community college. My experience was extremely positive there, much more so than a private school. But there are definitely gems of teachers that you can tell they really care and they really are invested in the outcome and value their students and see them as investments in the future and treat them as such. And then there are the teachers who are sort of just there, And in the capital, these would be the die-hard, core people that you would want to have educating children, trying to drive them to a more passionate, fulfilled, curious mindset. So then after they've had access to that, and all the while, at any level of education, every member has still access to the free online educational system. All of that is always available. And of course, on any of the campuses, be it in the capital or in the continued education campuses, mixed-use spaces that we talked about a little bit in the mission series. anyone of any age can have access and achieve whatever level of aptitude, so there's no longer these arbitrary age limitations on how far you can go into a subject. And I think that's really important too, because your aptitude in a subject is not necessarily tied to your grade level, these very arbitrary grade levels. And, so then you have situations where you have students, jumping, sorry, back to primary school for a second, but you have these situations where a child will skip a grade academically, but then to the detriment of their social development, to their ability to participate in sports and everything else, because they're not as big as the other kids, or the opposite, where people are held behind, and then there's a mismatch. And that whole thing doesn't really have a bearing on individual subjects, because they might be a savant at one thing and just not really into the whole STEM thing. So screw them, right? Like, how dare they? No, in the future, your aptitude in any given subject you can take as far as you want, and you're not limited by age. So you can progress along the skill matrix whenever, but there are campuses available to you in the boarding school phase, as well as, on into what will be like the high school part, and in this apprenticeship phase. All of that is prime time for utilizing the online education and taking a stab at different subjects, dipping your toe in and seeing if it's for you, or going really hard on it and progressing and being involved in that part of the community, in that educational discipline, maybe creating content, whatever, right? But during the apprenticeship, the idea and part of the brilliance of the structure that is provided by the conflicts is that you are sponsored and provided for and taken care of, your basic needs, all this time. I guess you would say universal basic income style, but it's kind of more just like stuff doesn't cost anything, so it's not quite the same as giving you a check every month to pay your bills. There just aren't bills for housing and basic food and things like this. And we'll talk more in detail about that at a later point. But just the freedom right off the bat, to really explore anything that you want. But during this apprenticeship phase, you do kind of have this push and this factional obligation's a bad word. I don't like that. In order to give back, right? Out of gratitude for having all of your needs provided for. Of course, you can choose to go into any subject that you want. But having spent the last period in the faction capital and getting a feel for the mission, it is strongly suggested then that you spend kind of the apprenticeship period performing a repetition activity with deliverables that would be conducive to your faction mission. And I gave the example, I believe, in Virgo, where anyone can be an artist in any faction, and you can do whatever medium, whatever subject, any of that. You have complete freedom. But there's sort of the suggestion that if you, as an artist, were to spend your apprenticeship formative kind of period, right, when you need to just learn the basics, when you need to just put the hours in and get the practice, if you were to spend that practice period doing things which benefit the faction mission, which the Virgo example was things like botanical illustrations for cataloging potential medicinal plants. That's a very specific example, but specifics can be helpful. Or doing physiological diagrams from dissections or something like that of people, animals, or whatever, right? Those are things that kind of fall under the victory condition of medicine through the artifice of art, of an artist. And in order to go on and form your own style and explore your own subject matter and all of that, you have to have a certain level of technical aptitude to get past the resistance phase, right? To get to the point where you can really accurately express yourself, you have to have some basic skill, and that just comes with reps, right? It's the same for bodybuilding, it's the same for anything. You've got to put the reps in, you have to do the iterations. And if you have more guidance to the iterations, you get higher quality practice, right? If you have a lesson plan. But the lesson plan doesn't have to be in these sort of curated higher ed way that we have now. I don't even know what the terms kind of are like nowadays, because mine were really wonky when I was in private school. I think it was trimesters or something. Oh, it was they were really short. Maybe it was even shorter than that. It was something like 10 weeks. Something just absolutely ridiculous. And they were all, it was architectures. It was all project oriented. It was just, you'd be cranking out an entire building a week. It was absolutely ridiculous. And you got no value out of it because, you're pulling the all-nighters trying to get these projects done and you're spending so much time on it, but it's not, it's a lot of time tripping on yourself, bleary-eyed late at night, autosave didn't pull through for you, stuff like that. It was a lot more putting out fires, dealing with technical mistakes, rather than getting quality reps, or really getting good at being able to go through that process or getting the practice for that thing. It was too fast. It was a breakneck speed. I really didn't get a lot out of it. I'm sure lots of people feel the same. So our current educational system, in that way, I'm sure for a lot of other people, is broken. They're not really getting the value out of the practice. So what would be much better is to offer structure, to offer, reading lists, to offer live lectures that can be attended, community formed groups, right? Book clubs, study groups, to have all of the campus openly available for people to meet and do that at their own pace, at a pace that makes sense. And different subjects are going to have different paces. You can't possibly cram every single discipline into the same, 10 or 15 week fiesta. It doesn't really make sense, and it puts way too much pressure on the educators to adhere to that format rather than being involved with the students, getting to know them personally, getting to know their learning style. So that structure is all available for the entirety of a person's life, but it's sort of suggested that during the apprenticeship phase, 21 to 28 or so, they're doing reps that will possibly create a deliverable that is relevant to their faction mission or really any other, right? If there was just something that they found that they particularly like, obviously anything that they do that's contributing to our advancement as a society, it's all good. They're earning their way, everybody's happy, they have meaning, society is benefiting because they're creating a deliverable that has value. And this is a stark contrast. People are always going to criticize and be like, why would anyone want to do that? It's like, okay, well, let's look at how we do it now. Let's talk about how it goes down right now. So as soon as you get out of college, let's go back to the artist example, because that's a fun one. What do? Straight out of college, you scramble and try to come up with a style that's in vogue, that's in meta, that, maybe it's based on whatever games or movies or whatever are popular right then, to try to do some fan art or come up with some kind of product or, get yourself on Patreon or whatever the case may be, to try to start generating revenue for yourself, because you have to still pay for your basic needs. So you're not doing the reps because you're really stressed out about paying the bills, right? There's already so much resistance, and so art's not easy. Nothing is, but art in particular has all that emotional hang up as well. So you have all of the weight of that on top of the pressure to perform that's coming from this weird outside amorphous source that is, the world at large, and what they're willing to purchase and what they're willing to support. So that's not really a great way to get good as an artist. All of that time that people typically say, like, oh, I'm finding my style. Are you, though? There's this emulation period. So ideally in the future there wouldn't be an emulation period. It would be this apprenticeship period where deliverables are being produced according to the guidelines of what's kind of identified as needed based on these kind of mission tickets. And we'll talk about that. I'm really in the thick of it, working on the outline of the website right now. I was kind of just stuck, you know, because I can only do so much. I'm already doing the art and the videos and music and all this other stuff on the sidelines, writing books and all this. So when this problem keeps presenting itself of like, oh, well, you know, in order to have this functionality and create this tool for the website, we need a programmer. Like, are you going to go and learn how to... I'm not a good programmer. I originally was going to go to school for computer science, but someone once told me you're either good at code and you get it, or you're just kind of not, and it's not necessarily something you can just practice and repeat and learn. And stupid me, I'm like, oh no, anyone can practice and get good at anything, right? No, I think this person definitely had a point. Like, code is one of those things, like, you either can program or you can't. You either get it or you don't. And I don't, but it became kind of obvious to me that I need to just create the outline of it. And it's particularly, I know I'm talking about myself a lot, I apologize, it's all I know. My dad used to say, and really stressed to me because he's a computer scientist, and when I started to become oriented towards that, he was like, oh no, oh, don't follow, and I wouldn't wish this on anyone, you know, don't follow in my footsteps. But also because he's part Leo, he's a Cancer Leo cusp, but so because of that, he's also like, oh no, of course you should, what else would you do? You know, it's conflicted. It's a weird cusp. We'll talk about cusps in detail. I have to figure out what... I don't think it's going to be the same as the mission videos, but that was specifically requested, and I am getting around to that. Hang tight. I have to figure out exactly how I want to do it, because it's a really good question, and I want to handle it correctly. So when I started to go down that computer science route, he stressed to me, it's going to be a problem, because technology is advancing at this exponential rate. He said, you know, basically what you have to try to do is train for a job that doesn't exist yet. You have to try to figure out what that is and be a step ahead, because otherwise, as soon as you graduate, everything that you learned is going to be obsolete already. You're going to have to continually retrain, and, you know, all growing up, he was always having to learn and relearn languages, and he'd have these big stacks of Java books and struts and all these other weird things. I just knew they had the cool animal pictures on them, and sometimes I'd flip through them and just be like, this is complete gibberish. But I kind of wanted to know that gibberish. I kind of wanted to understand. So I got this notion towards the end of high school. Oh, I'm gonna apply for computer science and engineering. You know, what could go wrong? Lots could go wrong, as it turns out. Getting rejected right off the bat being one of them, which is a story for another time. But I didn't know it then. I kind of understand it now. He was completely right, and the job that I actually wanted to do, I would not have really been able to get into if I had gone that route anyway. Hindsight's 20/20. But what I really wanted to be was a user interface designer, UX design. UX design was not a course that I could have taken. Not to date myself, but it was not available. It was not a program. So even if I had gone that route, I could have kind of got into it. It probably would have been okay, but I didn't have the real aptitude for it. I didn't have the passion for it because it wouldn't have been directed the correct way, because UX design wasn't a field yet. So technology is a really hard one to navigate in the way that our current educational system is set up. Could not possibly hope to keep up with it, and we need to keep really expanding more on the freely available education online, on open source software. Very, very important, so that young innovators can get involved immediately and not have to go through all of the hoops and barriers to entry of the academia, and also the existing industry standards. So hopefully this apprenticeship kind of period will solve a little of that problem, and give people both the structure and the freedom to really explore. And by the far end of it, around age 28, hopefully they would have been able to put in enough structured reps to have some level of mastery, right? That's when that would kind of be coming into its own. When you talk about the 10,000 hours or whatever it is, that would be pretty much around that age in whatever subject. Or you would be presented with a Saturn return with this totally new opportunity to reintegrate the inner child, and all of those lovely things, and reevaluate and maybe completely switch up and go off in a different direction. And you would have complete freedom, support to do that. I don't have a particular coming of age ritual as of yet. That might be something worth looking into for that age bracket. But the idea is just to ease that transition as much as possible and leave as much breathing room for the individual to make the choice that's right for them, and not one that is imposed on them by society, by, why aren't you married by now? Where's your career going? Why do you keep taking these dead end jobs? Why haven't you purchased a house? All of these really strange materialistic sort of gauges that we have established for success or for happiness, and put a lot of pressure at exactly the wrong times. So there's not necessarily the same bracket structure going forward into the subsequent brackets. There's talk about like your midlife crisis, happening a couple brackets from there and being something significant. I think that pretty much each bracket will continue cyclically, kind of going through that same, like, you spend some time at the start of the bracket reevaluating, rethinking priorities, possibly making a change, and then you go through another cycle, And I think even just thinking about our lives in this sort of 7-year based bracket rather than in decades, I think even that's really helpful just for anxiety, just for the overall mental state of it, because there's something so nihilistic and defeatist about decades and defining a human being in those terms. I don't think it's right. I think that we go through cycles more quickly, and so the way we talk about it has to be more accurate to that. And just the pressure. That's what we're really seeking to alleviate by restructuring. And whether it's by my ideas or anybody else's, I'm all for it, because the way that we do it is completely devastating to individual mental health and potential and development. And we're really sacrificing a lot of innovation that we just don't even know what maybe we've lost because we forced people down these roads. Yeah, it's so scary to think about, but things like curing cancer, things like the next big material innovation, could be locked away in the minds of people who have been forced to work fast food in their 30s or so, because that's not a vocation specifically reserved for teenagers to have some extra pocket cash to go to the mall. That's not how it works, and we know better, and we've known better for a really long time. So, knowing better, we should be doing better. And so I don't know if that really, I hope it at least answered the question as far as what the life cycle will start to shape up differently like, and the structures that we would need to put in place to implement that. So the main reforms for restructuring of the life cycle, besides the missions themselves, right, are implementation of Waldorf education for the younger years, and childcare doesn't fall under any one faction mission. I think that's something that we're going to have to look into. I personally, my mom took me to work with her for a long time. I got a lot of really great one-on-one time with my mom that I really am eternally grateful for. And a lot of people would be people are judgmental on moms for breathing, anything is going to be wrong. People, I think, would be probably really judgmental of her style of parenting these days, and they should be ashamed because it was very effective. Being present with her and in a shop. The earliest was a shoe store, of all things. And I remember being there and being active in that, and there's certain things about it. The most comical of which that she loves to bring up is the cash register, which I was just enamored with. It's funny us talking now, of course, about resource-based economy, and my first word to everyone's disdain was actually not mommy, but money, and not daddy. They're not super thrilled about that, but it is kind of funny, so I guess that makes it all right. I love the cash register. That sound just really got me, and I had this sense of business, and enterprise at a very young age. And I think that actually was a pretty good thing for me. And getting to spend quality time with her and kind of being on a team, I guess. Like, I've always been able to really, except for a few dark teenage years there, of course, angsty times, I've always seen my mom as being on a team with me, and that we were kind of working toward the same goal, and I attribute that to the quality of the early time. And she did both that and really let go at the same time, and I think that was really effective, because then when it came to be about preschool age, I had a bunch of years of preschool. I don't remember exactly how many. I went to like a super bougie, preschool situation, and which was mostly acting as childcare, but it was brilliant because I had the best of both. I had a lot of one-on-one intense quality time with my mom, and then also got to experience all of these other, adults, and then played with kids and was able to learn in that very hands-on way. It was also a very quality preschool, for what that's worth. I really felt like I got introduced to a lot of arenas right off the bat, and I was really well prepared, of course, for elementary school. I ended up being super socially awkward despite everybody's best efforts, just because I was just such a shrimp and, such a nerd. But the groundwork was laid. The efforts were made. I didn't have to be that way. And I think that should be available to everyone. I'm not saying that to be any kind of brag or anything like that. I'm saying I think that should be the standard. I think everyone should be entitled to that level of quality. They should both... I don't understand why contact with your parents is such a luxury in our American society and system. Like, not having paid parental leave is so bizarre. And that's a huge regret in life, is like not getting to see as much of my dad, because he was working all the time. And I love my dad. I will always be grateful for the sacrifices that he's always made to constantly be working and providing. I think he doesn't need to as much as he does. I think a lot of that is kind of his mental, but it's also his choice. I wish it didn't have to be that way. It's one thing if it's his choice, but the fact that there's so much pressure on the father to be working all the time, and for both parents to be working in most cases these days, but that pressure is so bizarre to me, and it runs so counter to our narrative, because we've got this narrative of like family values, but then we don't provide any sort of means to do that. And I was very fortunate. I got a lot of attention, and it was very quality, and they both gave a lot of themselves to make me what I am, and I just want to figure out how to make it that way for everybody. I want to make it available for every child to have both access to quality time with their own parents, but then also these avenues for childcare by potentially other adults to look up to and interact with. Obviously, qualified, vetted, screened. That's a whole issue as well. We want to be a bit more selective, I think, with the people who are in contact with our children. Isn't that a whole other topic? Um, but my experience was always extremely positive, wholesome, healthy, good. And I really, from the bottom of my heart, wish that for everyone, you know? So I'm sure in a lot of this, I come off as some sort of idealistic dictator, but that's not the intent. And I think in the conversation with the person who requested that I do this follow-up video, there was a lot of that tone. There was a lot of that, you know, oh, you're just trying to get everybody to do things your way. Like, no. I just read a lot of books. I study really hard. And I came to these conclusions when I posed the hypothesis that I think we can do better. Because I truly, truly want that. So, hopefully that answered at least that question. And I'll try to follow up and do some more of these more long format, rambly, for whatever that's worth. I think it's good to have both. I personally prefer the scripted videos because I like structure, but I think it's also probably good to put me on the spot to talk more candidly in the way that I would if I was explaining it to someone in person. So a big thing that I'm pushing this year on the channel is more variety, more diversity, making things available in different formats because it's gonna hit, different things are gonna hit differently for different people. So the most important thing is to have the variety and the choice. So thank you for sticking with me through this meandering journey we've been on this topic. I will do a more concise version in the future. It's good to do this, I think, as just a personal piece of advice. If you have a concept that you're fleshing out or working through, do this or sit in front of a mirror. Just talk through the problem and you'll be amazed at the solutions that you can come up with and practice at it. And, you know, it's one of the biggest problems that I've had on even working on any of this stuff, besides just the sheer volume and trying to organize such a huge amount of content, is doing this and really talking through. Sometimes it's good to do it completely alone, just in front of a mirror, in front of a video, because sometimes when you're talking to another person, even when there's someone that you value and trust, like, it's not really about their feedback and opinions. And sometimes their questions can be really detracting or distracting. And what you really need to do is just sit and talk it over yourself and formulate and crystallize and concentrate. And it might take a few times of doing that, but eventually you're going to get to a point where you just go, oh, that's how I should say it. And it becomes much, much easier than when people are asking you later on for clarification. Like, you've done the practice with yourself, because there's something very, it's like a spell, right? It's like how magic works, right? You've got an incantation, you've got an expression of intent, you've got this verbalizing of what you would like to see happen. And I think that's the basis of magic. And when you do something like this, when you do a blog or a video or a podcast or whatever, it's kind of casting a spell. It's kind of making a bit of magic because you're speaking your truth into being. And when you do that, you're giving it form. You're making yourself more accountable for the idea because you're giving it life. And I think it's always valuable to do that, you know, regardless of how many views it's going to get or what the reception's going to be or anything like that. It's good for your own personal process to get more insight into your own thoughts and your own world. Right? So, that's the life cycle bracket upgrade innovation. And I, of course, had to skim over a lot of stuff because I don't really want to give spoilers for the novel bit, but hopefully I included a little bit of a teaser without going overboard for that, because that whole process was such a trip. I wish I could talk more about it, but it's still in such infancy. I'm still editing, and I feel so strongly about it. And going through the process of writing it was such strong emotion, and I wish I could crystallize that right now. But it is not time. Time will come later. But just what a liberating experience. And I highly recommend anyone do that as well. Just sit and write about. I did it for the National Novel Writing Month, whatever, November. And yeah, one of the best things I've ever done. Just for the sake of doing it, just to flesh something out to that extent and really think about how you want things to be, you know, because a lot of people, they get too much traction, I think, online, just offering their criticisms, offering their opinions, offering their, without offering any solutions or really thinking about them, or letting their imagination go to those places and wonder what things could be like, what they could be like. Even just journaling, even thinking about yourself and your goals. I think when you write or you enunciate, you're speaking your truth forward and making yourself more accountable for sticking to it, right? Because if it just is always in your head and it's always just kind of a jumble, there's never any pressure to actually live it out, right? Nobody knows that you think these things, so no one's going to be like, hey, aren't you supposed to be living your dream of this and such? And so there's kind of a safety in it, but I think a cowardice too. It's very uncomfortable to be vulnerable in that way, but that makes it all the more valuable and good for you, I think, healthy for you. So I would love to see if anyone else wants to chat in this way. I'm really exploring different formats now, of course, in light of recent events. I don't think we're ever going to be like a podcasty or streamy, at least from me as a general. It's just kind of not my speed. But I definitely have been thinking more critically about what different formats are available and where these platforms are going, kind of what the future is going to be, because this has been a real stress test for all of the platforms, YouTube, Twitch, all of these things, which are being so much more heavily utilized. And it's really exciting time, because now that we're reaching kind of the critical mass of viewership and value on these type of platforms, there's the opportunity to kind of break through that plateau we've been at and start to explore completely new forms of communication. I'm personally geeking out pretty hard because I had speculated when I was doing more of the event hosting that there would eventually be a stream comprised of vendors who are essentially LARPing, right? They're in costume, selling their wares in this sort of home shopping network kind of format, except it's online and it's fantasy stuff. And as luck would have it, I highly recommend. I think it's the Fairy Ring. I'll try to find the link for it and put it below. I'm just really proud of them. I don't know, I'm geeking out on it really hard because I speculated that this is going to be a mode in the future, and here it is coming to life just this week. It just popped up and I'm just like, called it. It's so cool. It's fun to see dreams come to life, so you should always be, dreaming really hard. And I'm excited to see where they go with that, and how that kind of becomes a thing in the future, and how that changes potentially, advertisement, e-commerce. These things are so subject to change. So hopefully, besides resting, maintaining, reflecting, all the things that you should be doing this week in quarantine, well, this month, I hope that some of you are also maybe taking some brave leaps and steps and exploring totally new arenas of expression. So be brave. Be brave. And if you do, comment to me. I'd like to see what you all are working on as well. thank you so much for spending this time with me. I sincerely wish you all peace and health and wellness and safety, and I hope that you're all okay.